Hello everyone, Alan Sens here, and welcome to this video on the Minister of Foreign Affairs. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the Minister of Foreign Affairs and at their role in Canada's foreign policy decision-making process. So let's get started. So by the time we're done, you should be able to describe the significance of the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the conduct of Canadian foreign policy. Now, just a quick word on origins. The role, the portfolio, if you like, has a quite a long history reaching back to the Under-Secretary of State in 1896. And then the posting of Secretary of State for External Affairs was created in 1912. But from 1912 through 1946, that post, the Secretary of State for External Affairs, was held simultaneously by the Prime Minister. It wasn't until 1946 when Mackenzie King realized that the demands of the portfolio had become so great that really one person couldn't do both jobs. They couldn't do both Secretary of State for External Affairs and Prime Minister. And so he passed on the role to Louis St. Laurent, who became the first distinct or separate Secretary of State for External Affairs in 1946. That title was used by Canada right up until 1993, when the wording was changed to Minister of Foreign Affairs, or just Foreign Minister, if you like. And that title, of course, was more into line with international diplomatic practice. And that's why that change was made. So since 1993, we call our Minister of Foreign Affairs the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or sometimes simply Foreign Minister. Now, the significance of the Foreign Minister in Canadian foreign policy making is obviously central. There are a number of responsibilities and roles that the Minister plays. The most important, obviously, is they are responsible for the external relations of Canada. And that means policy development, it means setting priorities, it means the structure and arrangements for planning, it means implementing government decisions. And none of this is done in complete isolation, of course. Other ministers are involved, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it's really the Minister of Foreign Affairs who is the focal point for all of these responsibilities in the Canadian political system that are related to the external relations of Canada. Also, the Foreign Minister represents Canada abroad, and that usually comes in the form of summits with other foreign ministers. These are often called ministerials. And again, it's not in isolation. Other ministers may also be involved in ministerials. The defense minister, for example, will go to defense ministerials. But because the foreign minister is really the most prominent minister when it comes to external relations, these summits and these meetings, the foreign ministerials, are quite prominent and quite important. Finally, the minister is responsible for operating Global Affairs Canada. Now, of course, there's career bureaucrats and there's an entire administrative leadership structure to Global Affairs Canada, but the minister is in charge and brings their mandate from the Prime Minister, from the government of the day, to the offices, the functions, the priorities of Global Affairs Canada. So that is another important role. And of course, if there's to be any reform or restructuring, changes in leadership, the minister is responsible for those. Okay, so the role of the Minister of Foreign Affairs is actually quite dependent on the Prime Minister. And what I mean by this is that the extent to which a foreign minister has latitude, is able to take the initiative, has the entire file open more or less to their discretion, really depends on how the Prime Minister envisions that minister operating and the extent to which the Prime Minister wants to take on a foreign policy role. So let's take a look at a couple of examples just to illustrate this. So in the cabinet and the government of Louis Saint Laurent, there was a tendency for Louis Saint Laurent to give his foreign minister, Lester Pearson, shown here on the right, quite a bit of latitude. A very good example of this was the Suez Crisis, with Canada engaging in a major mediation role between France, Great Britain, and Egypt. And essentially, Lester Pearson was told by Saint Laurent to, quote, do what is best, do the right thing, and I'll back you, close quote. Well, I mean, those are great instructions to have, but I mean, talk about giving latitude to a minister, right? So this is an example where a prime minister is giving their minister a significant policy initiative role. In other cases, a less experienced or less senior minister might be appointed, and this is often a signal that a prime minister intends to take a more active role in foreign policy. And this was true of Pierre Trudeau, and with one of his foreign ministers in particular, Mark McGuigan. And this was an example of where Trudeau really wanted to have a major role in Canada's external relations. And so the foreign minister, Mark McGuigan, had less latitude, less flexibility, and less capacity to take the initiative on their own. In recent years, there's been a bit of a tendency for the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister to divide foreign policy among them. So the Prime Ministers will do some things, presumably the things that interest them, and Foreign Ministers will do other things, presumably what they're interested in. And a good example of this is the government of Jean Chrétien. And Chrétien, for example, did the Team Canada trade missions, these big missions to other countries that consisted of government officials and business leaders to try to increase Canadian exports and Canadian trade. Meanwhile, his foreign minister, Lloyd Axworthy, worked on a broader range of issues, particularly Axworthy's own pursuit of his human security agenda. So here's an example where the Prime Minister did some things and the Foreign Minister did others. Equally, more recently, was the government of Stephen Harper, and in that government, when John Baird came into the role as Foreign Minister, Prime Minister Harper always maintained a fair bit of control over foreign policy. He was one of those Prime Ministers who believed that the role of the Prime Minister did have an important external affairs component to it. John Baird, however, was quite a senior minister and was quite well trusted within Harper's government. And so this relationship was one in which the Prime Minister did have the leadership role, but John Baird did a lot of stuff on behalf of the government and was very much seen as a trusted hand within the portfolio. Now, most recently of all, of course, we have Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland. And here the relationship is much more one of team decision-making. Chrystia Freeland does have considerable latitude within the Trudeau government, but there's fairly close coordination between the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Defense Minister, and other ministers. And so here there's an effort to try to coordinate more than there is an effort to have ministers go off on entirely on their own initiative. Now, I've mentioned other ministers quite a bit, and the reality is that although the foreign minister is sort of the lead on foreign affairs, external relations, they're not the only actor in town, and other ministers play important roles. And those ministers include, but are not limited to, the Minister of National Defense, obviously responsible for the military aspects of Canada's security and foreign policy, the Minister of Safety and Public Safety, and Emergency Preparedness, which includes intelligence, operations, and security aspects of cyber security and so on. There's the Minister of International Trade Diversification, so we have a minister who's dedicated to trade issues that reports to the Foreign Minister. And we have a minister, in addition to that, of international development, focused more on development priorities for Canada abroad. So there is quite a large number of ministers, and as a result, coordination is extremely important, but not all it falls on one person. I think this diversification of the role is a relatively recent phenomenon and reflects Canada's significant engagement abroad. You really can't just have one person doing this anymore. Okay, now you should have a sense of the significance of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and perhaps a little bit of a sense of how the role of the minister sometimes does change depending on the wishes of the Prime Minister of any given period in Canadian political history. Okay, so that was just a quick overview. I mean, obviously there's a lot more detail, and we'll go into more detail later, but these are the fundamentals, and it's important, I think, to understand the relationship between the Foreign Minister, the Prime Minister, and the government, and of course the relationship between the Foreign Minister and Global Affairs Canada, if we're going to get a sense of how this minister navigates the decision-making environment of the Government of Canada. I hope you enjoyed this video. We'll see you again soon.